going to be talking about is stuff that goes back literally hundreds of years and goes forward some number of years. We're talking, as I assume some of you know, or all of you know, about what the purpose of government is, what good government is, what government should provide, what it shouldn't provide. And as you'll hear in my intro, this is a part of our 10th anniversary year series of shows. It's actually the first one in this particular series where we've sat down a couple months ago and said, what are some of the issues that we think are going to just be important in Oregon over the next decade? And this big, maybe too big philosophical question of what do we want from government? It's one of the topics that came up. The others include PERS and forest fires and homelessness, demographic changes, and I may be forgetting one. Anyway, that's a long preamble. The short version is I'm thrilled you're here. Samantha is going to be keeping an eye out for folks who put their hands up or grumble audibly or visibly. She's highly trained to see grumbles. Because we we'll have a succession of 5 folks from your community who you probably know well, who I'll be talking to sort of one after the other, but throughout, we really do want to hear from you. If you agree with what they're saying, or if you disagree, if you want to talk about your experiences, your questions, your thoughts about everything we're talking about. I urge you that the reason that we are here, I mean, we could have just called folks up and been in our studio, but the reason we're here is so we can actually hear from you all. So I have a habit of forgetting that as we go and getting engrossed in a conversation with the person who's right in front of me, but that's just because I care about what they're saying in that moment, but we really do more broadly want to hear as much from you all as you feel comfortable sharing. Some practical things: turn off or silence your cell phones if you haven't yet. We did a show yesterday with a fantastic author, and I said, as I always do, silence your cell phones, and halfway through the conversation, a cell phone went off, and it was some classical music ringtone that literally went on for 45 seconds. This poor person could not figure out how to silence the ring once it started. Anyway, don't have that be you this time. So silence your cell phones now if you don't mind. We'll take a break halfway through our conversation, just to, because on the radio conversation we take a break and so we build it in here. And I think, am I forgetting any important notes? Lois, if you don't mind coming up now. And so we'll have a little bit of music right now, because part of the stuff will be recorded to go onto the radio later, including a little bit of music and my intro. And when I say pretty soon, I will say we're coming to you today in front of an audience in Grants Pass. That is your cue, if you have local pride, to clap. So the radio audience will know that indeed we do have, yeah, you can have some cheerleading. We do have a live audience. All right, any questions before we start? No. How many of you are ready right now to speak your mind about what good government is, what bad government is, what government should do? How many? Okay, good. Keep that in mind as we go, because we'll want you to put your hands up so Samantha can actually see you, so you can be heard. All right. With no further ado, let's do it. This is Think Out Loud on OPB and KLCC. I'm Dave Miller, coming to you today in front of an audience in Grants Pass. As you might have heard, Think Out Loud turned 10 earlier this year. To mark our first decade on the air, we've decided to do a series of shows all around the state that will each focus on some big issue that Oregon is likely to be grappling with over the next 10 years. In the coming months, we're going to talk about PERS and homelessness and forest fires, among other topics. We're starting our series today with an embarrassingly large question. What is the purpose of government? In the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, the framers talked about the need to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to to ourselves and our posterity. These are broad goals for a government, but what do they actually mean in our daily lives as Oregonians? What services should government provide, and at what level, and what happens when the general welfare and individual liberty are at odds? Oregonians have been asking some of these questions since the very founding of this state, and they are still at the root of many of the biggest issues today, from marijuana legalization to logging rules to policing to public education to public lands. We're going to get some answers today and probably more questions from elected officials, from activists, and from educators. We start right now with Lois McMillan, a history teacher at South Middle School here in Grants Pass, a member of the Josephine County Planning Commission. Thanks very much for starting us off.
Thank you very much.
So let's start with just the absurdly big question and go from there. What do you see as the purpose of government?
Well, I think the purpose of government is to serve its constituents, and so and I kind of hate I hate the phrase "we run government like a business." I was telling Kate a couple weeks ago when I was on the city council in the city of Burley, Idaho, before I moved here.
I should say Kate Lasky, director of the Josephine County Library District, we'll hear from later on in the show.
Just a little later. We were talking about this very question. And one of the best things that was ever told to me was an ex-governor from the state of Idaho. And when I ran for city council, I said, I'd like to run it like a business. It was the first meeting. It was at a Chamber of Commerce meeting. And the governor, his name was Governor Evans, he ran a bank. And he came up after and said, you know, Lois, you did a great job. Could you come see me afterwards? And I said, oh, yeah. And I'm thinking, man, I know he's going to tell me how great I am. It's going to be a great moment for me. It wasn't. I go in and he says, Lois, never, ever, ever say you're running business. You're running a government like a business. Because a business tries to run at a profit. And the government provides services. That's the purpose of a government. And so that's always going to be the rub. And it always stayed with me. It stayed with me through the budgeting process. And when I'm teaching, I talk about, you know, does this make a better society? Does this improve not just ourselves, but does it benefit posterity? We always go back to the preamble of the Constitution of those purposes. But I think the purpose of government is to serve the people that are in it.
Often when we talk about what the framers of the Constitution thought about some issue, there's a debate, because there are a lot of different ways to read both the Constitution and what they wrote about it in various papers after. How unified were they on the basic question of what the purpose of government was, let alone how it should be set up?
They were not unified at all. And going into the Constitution Convention, I mean, I'm a teacher of history. I'm Oregon History Teacher of the Year, really proud about that. And in the summers, I teach at different universities. Last summer, I was with Richard Brookhiser. He's at NYU. Wrote a couple books on founders. There is no common mind of any of the founders. They were definitely split on the purpose of government. So when you hear people say, the founders said, I don't know what they're saying, because there was over 50 of the Constitutional Convention coming in and out. And today you see the split that was the same split back then. The split between Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians. The fight between do we want a strong federal government, or should all the power stay with the states? Going into the Constitutional Convention, it was the states that had the power. And people like George Washington and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were saying, listen, we need a strong federal government. And so, you know, it was the state that had the powers. And so that rub is still with us today. And even the discussions of how economically how we'll go forward. I mean, Hamiltonians were urban-minded and had a view of the federal government that would be a strong federal government. So did Washington. On the flip side, Jeffersonian was definitely on the rural side of things. And so, and he had no clue economically. He was a southern plantation owner, and his labor was free. So he didn't really understand the economics of it. But that rub is from the very beginning of time. And you can look at it all the way back to the colonial times. There is no one mind with the founders. And so when people say that, I just don't get it. And I think that what's wonderful, I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Constitution, of course, and the processes that went with it. So I'm not criticizing the Constitution, but there were flaws in it. But it's that working together and moving towards a compromise that really made some of the great things that we see today and are flowering today.
Let's move to some concrete things. Because in addition to being a history teacher, a Constitution teacher, you're also a member, as I mentioned, of the Josephine County Planning Commission. How much do you think about these issues of the purpose of government when you're serving on that commission?
I personally see it every single time. Every single time there's a person coming before us. It's really hard for a member of the public to stand right before you and speak to you, especially if it's personal. We're in my land use, with land use, it is as personal as it gets. The history of the United States is about land, and we're talking about nothing more personal than their land. And so when they get up to speak and say, this is how it's going to affect me, I am absolutely listening. And that my job, I'm appointed. The mayor is elected. The mayor and the council appoint me. So I take that very seriously when they come before us, and how I'm to serve not just that person's interests, but the interest of the common good. Because we also have to make sure that it's good for everybody.
I'm just curious, as we're talking about what government can provide, just with a show of hands, or if you'd prefer clapping so our radio audience could hear it, does everybody think that, that there should be a public police force? By a show of, by clapping, anybody think there should not be a police force? Okay, what about public schools? Is that something that... Anybody think that...
No!
No. Let's get a mic to you then. I'm not sure where the no came from. All right. We will, you may be alone in this room.
You know, public school, only private school or homeschooling.
Okay, why is that?
Because public schools is run by National Education Association and all Marxists.
What do you mean when you say that?
Well, it's just see what they're teaching our kids.
For example, what?
If they're coming out of school, they don't know your Constitution, they can't even tell where the state of Washington is, they can't tell who your first president is, they can't even add and subtract, but they know how to, anyway.
Oh, okay. Lois McMillan, you're a teacher.
Well, if none of my children know who George Washington is, they definitely know who George Washington is. And if they don't know him, they are not going to say I'm their teacher. And I respect that rub between wanting a private education. The founders, and I believe strongly, especially as a responsibility of the state, that we are to educate our children, and that we want an educated public. Certainly the founders thought that. And that the way to rise in a society is to become educated. There is no other path. I was telling you earlier that today I taught Frederick Douglass, and he saw, his destiny, his hope through learning how to read. And so that's where I find I am a public school teacher, and I really don't consider myself a Marxist or any kind of political affiliation. As a history teacher, I stay far away from any kind of politics. I teach the history of it, but education is the hope for our children. And I just have to tell you, this generation of kids, I mean, you can ask any teacher right now, they are amazing. They are going to outshine us far. There's so much hope out there. It's so outstanding how they see their contribution to the common good. They're not
speaking
selfish.
of the common good, I want to, again, by a show of applause, get your take on other things that government provides currently. What about things like roads and bridges? Get out of public infrastructure like that. Let the private sector completely do that. Okay, what about Social Security? Yes? Anybody says no? Okay, the same man there in the audience. I want to get a diversity of voices, so we may come back to you, but before that, what about government assistance for the health care of poor Americans, older Americans, and kids, meaning Medicare and Medicaid? And applause people who are against Medicare and Medicaid. All right. I'm curious about one of the big issues in Josephine County recently, which is, as everybody in Oregon is aware of, not voting for various public safety levies over a number of years. That changed actually just last year. But I'm wondering if residents here have gotten simply used to having fewer government services. If after a while of not having them, you start to say, you know what, we'll get by without them. Has anybody, I'm seeing some shaking of heads, meaning no, has anybody started to feel that way? Lois McMillan?
I do have an opinion here. I think that, I feel strongly that when, like our sheriff, Daniels have gone to the voters, I think he does a great job of being very precise in what he's asking for. He really, they looked at every single thing and asked for the bare minimum. I really believe that. And when you have a discussion with him, I really want to be in a safe community. And so when he put that budget together, I think he provided what the services, not too much. It wasn't going to be the Cadillac. I really think that, especially at our local level, we know where that money's going. I think when we get insecure when it goes up to the state and then the federal government, that we lose that in-touchness. Like Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. I feel really good about my local politics. When we passed the library district, I was really excited. We knew what was going to be next.
We're going to hear more about the library district in a bit, and Lois, we may hear more from you as well. Thanks very much. That's Lois McMillan, history teacher at South Middle School here in Grants Pass. John Chambers joins me now, former small business entrepreneur, now devoting his time to promoting a better understanding of the U.S. Constitution. John Chambers, thanks very much for joining us.
I wondered where the applause went.
Can't hear you.
So, as I mentioned, you've devoted a lot of your time, for decades now, to teaching about the U.S. Constitution. Why?
Well, you have to start with the hard questions, don't you?
Is this a hard question for you? I mean, you devoted your life to this now.
It just seems that if we want a future, we're going to have to follow the Constitution. The Constitution was drawn up, and the purpose of it was, going back to the purpose of government, the purpose of it was declared in the Declaration of Independence that governments are instituted among them to secure these inalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, which is just the beginning. There is also a number of other ones as well. And we've strayed away from that, and the reason that we're even talking today about the purpose of government is because everybody in this room and everybody listening in the radio audience recognizes that the government is not doing what it's supposed to do. It's strayed from its original purpose. So,
well, you're making a big assumption that everybody agrees with you, I think. You're assuming that everybody who's listening to this radio show right now, or in this room, thinks that currently our government has strayed from its original purpose.
okay. All right, I'll back off from that. They recognize that other people think that people have strayed, and they find out what their opinion is so that they can counter it.
Well, let's get to the straying. Where have we strayed?
Well, for instance, most politicians and TV pundits and so on talk about our democracy. It was never set up as a democracy, it was set up as a republic. It was supposed to be a republic, but we've lost the definition of what a republic is. So we've now gone back to falling back on it's a democracy, which is why one of the books I've written is called What is a Republic? Very small book, but it gives a concise definition going back to Aristotle And Plato's Republic, which was not about a republic, by the way, it was misnamed by somebody later, but it is the definition of what a republic is, and this is what the Constitution was hoping to make for us. So I run Constitution Study Group here in Josephine County. I now have the national one that I do by email, but anyway.
But if I understood you correctly, though, I mean, that's a question of semantics and perhaps civics education.
Oh, no. Yes, very much civics
Right.
education. It's not semantics at all.
We're talking about definitions, but what I'm curious about is where government, you think, has gone wrong.
Okay, the purpose of government is to, going exactly to what previous, sorry, I forgot.
Lois McMillan.
Well, Lois said, the purpose of government is to enable a person to do what he could not do on his own. That's why we work together. I cannot reach on my own the audience that you can reach, so you and I work together. And to do that, you and I have certain agreements and governing principles in our interaction with each other. That's the government of this. And it enables me to reach who I could not reach before. So the purpose of government is, of any government, anywhere, whether it's a business or it's a society, is to enable a person to do what he can't do on his own.
Where do you see the tensions between individual rights and the common good? I mean, for example, if there were no speed limits, people could do whatever they wanted. There might be, more accidents, or we could have prohibition on going over 20 miles an hour on every single road in America. There'd be fewer fatal accidents, but it would take all of us and all of our goods longer to get where we were going or we wanted them to go.
There's always a price to pay. There's a difference between freedom and liberty. Freedom is you can do anything you want. Liberty is you can do anything you want as long as it doesn't hurt somebody else. That's why you have stop signs, so that you will stop so that somebody else is able to go and you don't have a crash. And you exercise your liberty by doing that, but you don't have freedom to go anywhere you want, as fast as you want, and to heck with everybody else. So,
do you think we're striking the right balance?
No.
So where are we falling short? Where do we need more liberty?
I believe that where we need more liberty is, well, so usually I just teach the Constitution, just straight what the Constitution says. You now ask me for a little bit more of an opinion and to get into a political discussion. Okay, I am a card-carrying conservative. I'll even pull out my wallet and I'll show you the card. However, when I was in LA, I did a series of presentations in neighborhoods with a lady who is a member of the Democratic National Committee, very nice lady. And she and I bounced off each other in these presentations. It was never an argument and we never debated, but it was when we were just describing what does the Constitution say. And when I would go a little far off on one side, she would pull me back, and when she'd go a little far off on one side, I'd pull back. So I would rather not, well, I could. Your question again.
Well, if you don't feel comfortable, that's fine, because we have an entire audience of folks here who may want to answer that question about, or may feel more comfortable answering it. And sir, perhaps you're ready. What's your name?
My name is David Scouthouse. I think what John's trying to reach for, what he's questioning is, I think a lot of Americans feel like they're betrayed by the government in ways that come like when they outsource jobs to other countries and then they pay money for companies to go there from our own lands to employ other people. And I understand why our government does that, but it makes it harder for us as Americans to get good jobs, because if your tech jobs are in another country, you're having a hard time making it here. You follow what I'm saying? So I think what happens is prosperity. I think a lot of Americans feel like our government doesn't always promote our prosperity over other people.
Theoretically, there would be a way to take care of what you were talking about, which is that we could vote out the elected officials who are putting forward the policies that you don't like. Do you feel like that could work?
I don't know if that would work, because I think there's always going to be a certain need. Because I understand why they do it, but I do know that I feel as an American that it's harder for me to make ends meet. It's harder for me to move forward, and I do know that over the course of at least the last 50 years of some of the treaties we've made, we have really kind of put ourselves in a hard position, you know, manufacturing-wise and things like that. You heard in the newspaper, that such and such company is coming back to the US to employ people. And it's just like the BLM here. You know, we used to get payments here in Josephine County for our wood because we gave up, you know, our lands to the federal government, which I love the fact that we have, you know, all these parks and all these different, what do you call, forests that are available to us. But at the same time, 78% of our land is no longer with us here in Josephine County. We don't own it anymore. It belongs to the federal government. So, and I don't want a handout from the federal government. I just know that what I guess I'm saying is, I know a lot of people in this room probably feel like somehow the government just isn't looking out for our prosperity, and I don't know how to reach that point where we feel comfortable with our officials, and maybe it's transparency, but where we feel comfortable with our elected officials that they're telling us the truth, and there's not someone who's, you know, we'll say a lobbyist, paying them on the side to vote a certain way. And that's, and I don't know, maybe that's what we need to do, is get rid of the lobbyists.
Yes.
I don't know how to fix it.
We have, yes, John Chambers, and then we have a gentleman in the back.
Sure. There actually is a measure that could be done that would get rid of the lobbyists. And what it is right now, our House of Representatives, each member of the House of Representatives represents 750,000 people approximately. You cannot go around shaking that many hands and kissing that many babies. What we need to do is have smaller districts. There is nothing in the Constitution that says you have to have 435 representatives. Those representatives no longer represent us. They represent the people that are going to be able to give them the money to be able to put out television ads to convince us to vote for them.
Do you think that tripling the number of people in the House of Representatives would reduce the influence that very powerful corporations have currently through
No,
lobbyists?
I think you have to multiply it by about 10.
Oh, okay. So you're talking about an enormous increase in the federal legislature.
I'm talking about each representative represents approximately 80,000 people, which is how many people are in Josephine County.
More like
for
a
instance.
mid-sized town mayor.
More like a mid-sized town mayor. And
How many people in this audience like that idea of, I mean, if we're not crazy about Congress now, having 4,000 Congress people. One clap. You happen to be the person who wanted to talk earlier. So, sir, what's your name?
My name is Ron Ruby. My point that you had mentioned, that it's our choice then to elect somebody else.
Well, I was asking if you feel like that could make a difference.
Well, to your point, for us to elect somebody else or replace any of our elected officials only lasts as long as they're in the office. You have a bureaucracy that runs Washington, you have a bureaucracy that runs Salem, and you have a bureaucracy that runs Grants Pass. And you can change your elected officials all you want. And we have examples of that in Washington where Congress is asking for information that they're required to have to investigate our FBI and those things that are going on right now.
If I understand you correctly, in a sense, it seems like what you're describing is what people now call the deep state. That there's
Well,
this.
they prolong everything until that person is no longer head of the committee or that elected official is out of office.
But if I
And they
understand you
cannot
correctly, you're
do
saying
any
that because of
president-
this, you don't feel like you have a real ability to affect change, whether at the county level, the state level, or the federal level, because you see an entrenched government class who is there working against your interests. Is that a fair way to put it?
Well, I think you have a bureaucracy that is fed by both parties. And, you know, when they attack one spot of it, they keep feeding it more money. They keep giving it more money. As long as they get money, they're satisfied. You blame the lobbyists are the ones who lobby the bureaucrat to do what they
Can I
want.
ask you, sir, is there some personal experience you've had, as opposed to, you know, reading a newspaper or hearing things on the radio or TV, but a personal experience from your own life that has led you to this point of view?
You know, we studied the Constitution with John.
Okay.
So we see these things that have occurred, and I mean, if you would have to be living in a dark room someplace and never listening to anything if you can't figure out what's going on in Washington today.
How many other people in the room, whether or not you use the same words to describe what the last two gentlemen have talked about, how many of you feel like you can affect change in the way that you'd like to, whether at the county level or the state level or the federal level, that you feel like your voice actually matters? About that, because that's a very different point of view than we've just heard. Where?
You asked for a personal example of a bureaucracy. I was an Army Reserve officer for about 20 years, and here's how it really worked. Two weeks a year, we'd go back to some military base and train. And what we learned as being reservists, when you went back to a military base, it didn't matter who the general was or who the colonels were. What you had to do was figure out who is the civilian that's been there forever. If you want billets, if you want ranges, if you want food. And that was the truth. And they sort of made a joke out of it. Oh, General so-and-so is going to be gone next year. And so I'm sure that's how the federal government works, is that they don't care who the president is in the FBI or all these federal agencies, because they run their own deep state, and politicians come and go, and they keep getting paid and promoted. So, my experience.
Thank you very much. We had some hands up here about the sense that you actually can make a difference. What's your name?
My name is Mayana Kingery, and I feel like by inspiring other people and coming together in larger numbers, we have more power and authority. And by calling out corruption, by seeing it, speaking to it, and being vocal, that's what it takes to affect change. We have to rise up together, and especially now, our youth are really starting to come forward. I got to speak with a couple of classes, high school classes today, and you know, as she said, Lois said earlier, these kids are amazing, and it's our responsibility to nourish and guide them, and they're going to come up and rise up, and they're going to be the ones that vote and change the structures so the good old boy system doesn't win anymore.
Thanks very much. John Chambers, you call yourself Mr. Constitution, as I understand it.
Actually, I don't call it. When I first wrote my Constitution Study Guide, a Boy Scout master in Texas started calling me that, and then when I came here to Josephine County, my Constitution Study Group started calling me that, so I said, okay, I guess that's what I am.
Fair enough. It didn't come from you.
No.
You haven't thrown it off either. Do you carry around the Oregon Constitution? Do you carry around the Josephine County Charter, or is your focus on the U.S. Constitution?
My focus is on the U.S. Constitution because that is an excellent example of what good governance should be. And what I'm concerned about is not really the Constitution. I'm concerned about good governance and that we have good governance. And I use that as an exemplar of what good governance would be.
John Chambers, thanks very much. Mr. Constitution, but he's not arguing with it either. I'm joined now by Kate Lasky, the director of the Josephine County Library District. Great to have you on the show. So we're talking about the purpose of government today, and you're in an interesting place because, in a sense, you've been creating one for about a year now. We talked briefly about the public safety levy that did pass a year ago. Along with that was your library district. Can you describe the district that you're in charge of for folks who are not familiar with it?
Certainly. I'd like to start by saying that our name of our library is Josephine Community Library District, not Josephine County Library District. That's, I think, important for this conversation because the library system wasn't funded, or it was defunded by the county due to really an economic crisis in our community. So back to your question, just describing what this library district is. It's a newly formed government. It's a special district, which means it's its own entity. It collects, well, it doesn't actually collect taxes. I guess the county treasurer collects the assessor and the treasurer work together to collect the taxes. And then we receive taxes that are designated for library services. These are property taxes. And then we are charged with budgeting those and providing a service to those residents within that boundary, an excellent public library service. And that boundary is what's referred to as non-contiguous. So we have 4 branches in Josephine County, and each of them is surrounded by sort of an island of service. And what we discovered over these last several years of funding libraries through donations and trying to pass library measures to support libraries with property taxes is that people who don't receive the service don't value it because they don't have it. So we shrunk our district down to the areas where people receive service. So it is a service district, if you will.
What has it been like for you personally to create a new government entity, a new public agency of a sort?
It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It's been a really steep learning curve, an excellent way to work with other other government agencies within the system, and I think it makes me feel that pure sense of what is the purpose of government, the ideal of what is government. We have an opportunity at our library district to do it right. And it's really small, and I wouldn't even presume to know how to do that at, Lord knows, a national level, but even a county level I think is challenging, and a city level is challenging. But we are just a library, and we're small, and we get to be transparent and set up our policies and write our budget in the most innovative way that we can, and we get to continue as a government agency to employ volunteerism at a very high level.
Has this made you think differently about what government is or how it should function?
I think it's made me think more, not necessarily differently. I believe that when you go back all the way to the Constitution and you move forward in time, we're always learning what government can do and more about what it can do. I don't know if I'm learning something different. I think it's always about relationships and how people work together. And we are forming and creating procedures and policies that allow us to do something great together. And for us, it's a great library. For a city, it's a great city. And then it just goes from there.
My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that people who live outside of those islands you were talking about, they can still use the library services if they pay a yearly fee of about, like, what, $60 or so per household?
Yeah.
How many people are actually doing that, opting in, even though they're outside of the district?
Well, I have exact numbers for you. So the library district has been operating since January 1st as the fully functional public library. And in that time, we've had 25 property owners annex their property in from outside the district boundary. So they say, I want to pay taxes, please tax my property in the next election, and I want to be a part of the library district, which is a whole other Oregon revised statute process. Then we have 73 people who paid for their library card fee. And then we had, I believe, 12 children who received grants who didn't have services outside. And we had 6 adults who received grants.
What is this library?
Two property owners.
You really are, you do have all the numbers.
Yeah, okay, sorry, I'll stop.
No, it's fine. I should tell people on the radio that there's no card here. All these numbers have come directly from your head.
That's because I have a great staff who gives me great reports.
What has this new incarnation of the library, this revived and saved library, meant for the community? I'm just curious to hear from folks in the audience. I was thinking about words this time. Since we're talking about libraries, if you don't mind, so what does it mean?
My grandmother is getting older, and in that process is wanting to keep her brain active as she's constantly reading books to keep active and keep learning in an effort to stem aging, essentially. And she's constantly buying books and recently found that these brand new release books are offered at the library. And so she's constantly going down to the library and bringing books home, then loaning them to me or neighbors even and saying, okay, I gotta go check them back in and I'll get them back for you. But she's found an opening that she hadn't seen before that will save her money on her retirement income. And I've always seen the libraries as something for kids or studying in school. But for me, I'm seeing a direct impact on my grandmother in an attempt to stay active and alive and vibrant. And so I'm grateful.
Actually, that's Lily Morgan, Commissioner for Josephine County. For all of you, I mean, it's hard to think of something more specific in terms of government service than a library district, where the entire point is to be a library. I mean, you were saying earlier, Kate Lasky, that county government or state or federal government is a trillion times more complicated. But is there some lesson for those more complex forms of government that you could learn from a library? I mean, from running one of the more basic kinds of public services. Is there something that could be applied to the more complex kinds of government?
I suppose what I would suggest is asking more questions about how it has to be, because I spend a lot of time reading the statute and asking experts, how are you doing it and how does it have to be, and then checking with an attorney, because all of our laws are written by lawyers, and that's not very easy to understand. So we have to talk with each other about what is the truth and the interpretation of this law, and how can I change my policy or my procedure or my budget to better communicate and serve the taxpayers within this area.
You know, we have some other elected leaders in the room here right now. How many of you are, I hope you feel honest enough to answer this question because it's an embarrassing question perhaps, but how many of you are confused by the complexity of the laws that you're charged to enforce in various ways? I mean, is that, as we just heard, these are written by lawyers, they're hard for lay people to understand. I guess the question is, do you feel like they're too complicated for you to even wrap your heads around sometimes? Any elected leader want to answer that question?
I think there's two of us here.
Yeah, so Darren Fowler is here, the mayor of Grants Pass. Is government too complicated even for the people who are governing?
Yeah, simply put, I think you're right. It is too complicated and it's gotten too big to where nobody could track it all. You can only look at certain facets of it, try and get a lawyer to interpret, and then try and find your way. And especially if you're in a rural part of a state and not in the population centers, you're even more removed from the whole lawmaking process, and it becomes more frustrating. You feel like they're not listening, they don't hear rural America, and so we really have to ramp up our getting together and being collective about what we say.
If you don't mind sitting tight there for a few more questions, because I do have some more questions for you. You mentioned the rural areas. I'm wondering, obviously we're talking here in Grants Pass. How different do you think this conversation would be if we were in a more rural part of Josephine County?
Right, I think we have that example at our branch libraries that are smaller out there, that some of them don't even have a working bathroom at this point. I mean, that's where when the funding disappeared and the county wasn't able to sustain some of those services, we've had that kind of trouble, staying in buildings and using volunteers until they're feeling like they can't volunteer anymore. And so I was really glad that the library got that district, but it's that same microcosm, because the city of Grants Pass is the nexus, but so much of the rural community uses us as their business center and then goes back to their community and sees that their services are nothing like what the city can afford or what a larger city can afford up north.
As we've talked about, last year voters in Josephine County approved the library district, the public safety levy, plus 2 fire levies, and I think another one as well, an animal control levy. I don't think there was a levy last year that didn't pass, and this is after, I think, was it 9 public safety levies over the last decade plus hadn't passed. What happened last year?
Yeah, it was like 5 that hadn't passed, But I think that there was finally hey, we've got the government whittled down to a point that they can't do much for services, and they were noticing that they called the sheriff and nobody would come, and that they needed to get back to basic service levels. And so I think the citizens of the county of Plymouth said, all right, let's take it back up and see if we can trust our government leaders with this much money. Before we give them the full amount they used to have, let's give them some of it back and see what they do if we can increase that trust between the people running the government and the people that are paying for it.
Did you feel that, I mean, and Grants Pass, obviously the city is different from the county where a lot of this was more focused, but did you feel that as an elected leader that you were surrounded by people who were maybe mistrustful of your collective ability to spend money? Did that affect the way you thought about fiscal issues?
Absolutely, because our community is not one that stays quiet. They do speak up when something's going on or something might change.
Nods all around you, right?
They do, and so as a city we had to do different things. We put a fee on the water bill to pay for jail beds so that we could put some of the bad actors away in our town. And so we had to really think outside of the box about how we were going to protect our own citizens, protect our livelihood before the good people started leaving.
Can you give us an example from your time as mayor of where you think government worked well?
Just in our community?
It needn't be, but I mean, if that's the example that comes to mind, you can toot your own horn.
Just in the jail bed example, we ended up going to the state legislature, our chief of police, and changing the laws to allow a sobering center where you could take someone that hadn't done a crime, just was not sober, and put them into a safe place where they'd stay for 24 to 48 hours, and then they could go back out, and they'd have a chance to look at services then. So that was one way we chose differently than what tradition had chosen. Now other cities are looking at it as a model.
You know, that's a great example because that's not in the Constitution. I mean, and a trillion policy things that we could talk about now, were not around in the 18th century. How do you decide that that's a good use of public funds, public resources, what the city is doing?
Well, I think it's because the whole county put us in an emergency mode where we were trying to think of anything we could do to make sure our citizens were safe. Because we didn't have basic services from our sheriff any longer or our jail. We had to really reach outside, and that when you squeeze a government like that, you can really see what the good parts are the only ones that are going to come out, because it'll reveal the bad things, but also the good ones will make it to the top. And the citizens go, okay, those people are looking out for our best interest and doing the best they can with what they got.
Lois McMillan, I saw you wanted to jump in here. Let's get the mic to you.
I just want to kind of go on the sobering center, because I think it was an example also in this county that we saw something really innovative come in and solve a solution. I think Lily Morgan came before the Planning Commission and showed us this sobering center, and when they saw how much money was going into policing somebody that was drunk on the street and then arresting him, that's a lot of resources that you're putting out. And the sobering center was such an innovative idea. I just thought that because we were starting to whittle down government, innovative solutions like Lily came up with came to be. I also think that the reason that a lot of the features pass, or a lot of these things pass, is because we started to redefine what we wanted. And the loud voices that say we never want anything didn't win out. I was really pleased that the negative didn't win, that the positive of let's make this a better community won out this last election cycle.
I'm curious, so I asked it for a positive example, and you both gave me one. What about a negative example where somehow local government at some level got it wrong? And Mr. Mayor, if you'd like to...
I have an easy example.
Okay. And then I want to hear from the audience as well.
We tried to get a grant to do some sidewalks, and to do some bus shelters, and by the time we got done, they were over $100,000 each. We did 5 of them for $530,000, and councilors had to hold their nose because we'd already paid for engineering. And anytime you get the federal government money involved, it really messes up small communities because you have to go through such red tape like that. A bus shelter that should have cost $5-6 grand ended up costing $105,000. And just an embarrassing example of how government should not be working.
What lesson did you take from that?
That at the beginning you got to know the whole thing you're going towards, because once you get down the track a ways and have spent money, you've got to make a harder decision than you could have made at the beginning when you said, no, we don't want to go that way.
John Chambers, Mr. Constitution has his hand up.
Also, what it shows you is that federal money always has strings.
I mean, what's wrong with that?
Yeah.
If the federal government is going to say, we're going to give you money,
Strings that you never knew about, and you end up in a contract which they can change and sometimes do. Like, for instance, Social Security. That's changed a number of times.
so that,
I can answer that.
you can, what can you, but let's get the mic. We have a hand up there from somebody we haven't heard from yet, and then so we will get to you again. Sir, what's your name?
Ron Smith. As an example of the strings attached to something, HUD grants, okay? The change to the Fair Housing Act now requires a city or county to take the HUD grant to give demographics of every neighborhood in their county or city. They want to know race, religion, origin of country, and income. That information goes back to HUD. HUD takes a look at every community in that area and says, this community is not racially integrated. We must force low-income housing into this community, whether the community wants it or not. What you've actually essentially done is traded local control back to the federal government over your zoning and planning. That's an example of a grant that should really be weighed out. Most people who vote for grants don't like the strings. If you get to our age and you think there's such thing as free money, I have oceanfront property in Arizona, I'd like to say.
What's your thinking about what the federal government should do? I mean, do you disagree? It's one thing to say that you don't like these particular strings because you don't like the policy behind it, for example, or how it might be used. It's a different thing to say that you don't think the federal government should have any strings whatsoever, because there may be some other example, I suppose, where you liked the policy behind the requirements.
I got a question for you.
Yeah.
How does
Well,
a
wait, could you answer my question
How does
first?
a country that's $21 trillion in debt have grant money to spread around like $600,000 for streets in Merlin? I don't understand where that money comes from. And what we're doing is we're putting our children's children in debt to the bankers. That's why grants are dangerous. They don't have the money, they're making money from thin air.
That's an important point to bring about fiscal
It's a
responsibility.
very important point because
But I'm curious about the
future
larger
of
one, because
America.
we're also talking here about local control or state control or federal control. Do you disagree with the basic idea that if the federal government is going to give, say, a school district money or a city, that they should be able to have some strings attached in order to give that money? Do you disagree with that idea?
Well, I think the question you need to ask is why is the federal government overseeing education? That should be at the state level. That didn't come about until Jimmy Carter.
Okay, but that wasn't the question. But I want to move on. We have to take. We'll get one more comment here, sir.
I can make it strings attached very simple.
Yeah.
You ask me for money and I say, you want to do home improvements in your home, and I say, I'll give you $100,000. And you take it from me, and I'm going to tell you how you're going to run your home, who you can invite into your home, where the kitchen sink should be, how many toilets you could have. See, that's why the strings are dangerous. Strings are very dangerous because the government tells you what you can and cannot do. And that's why we should be very careful when we take a grant with strings
I
attached.
think it would be an opportune moment to ask who is the government when we're talking about
Yes.
this. I mean that it's us. This is our shared agreement to work together. This is our city, our county, our library. And there's often that emotional charge, like something doesn't go right and I didn't get my way in the group. And that happens to every one of us. And how do you handle that? Do you bring forth a solution and do the hard work to make it change? And if we get lost, I think it's easy to get lost, not in a judgment way, but just in the overwhelming sense of trying to just make our families thrive and our communities thrive, get lost in the we and the they, and forget that it's us. We are doing it together.
This is where I think the politics do get involved, because it's very hard in any society, I think, to have a completely dispassionate conversation about government that is divorced from the particular policies of the people in charge at whatever level. And the sense I get is that is that sometimes, based on who is in charge, whether it's the mayor or the president or people in Congress, if you like what they stand for and what they're putting forward, it seems to me that you may feel more closely aligned. You might use the us and the we and say government is us. If you don't,
Right.
that's when people say, for example, not my president.
Right.
Or they talk about what's happening in DC as being completely separate from their lives, or at least foreign to their ability to affect change. I mean, in this room right now, how many of you at the federal level really think that way, that think about we and us? And how many don't? Okay,
So I think it is levels. So if you focus down to the local level, it's a lot easier to be engaged and solve these problems. And it's a lot easier, people still check out though. So I just had my ballot, I just voted, and there was a watershed council that had absolutely no candidates. And there were other uncontested candidates in several positions. So at the local level, I do think maybe people feel disenfranchised or not engaged, but it is really hard to take it up to the national and feel like one voice can make a difference, but it can.
let's take another comment from our audience. Sir, what's your name?
Lee. I'm actually a teacher at North Middle School. I teach social studies over there as well, and I have two things. First of all, as we talk about why these rules for public housing exist, I can't help but think about civil rights and the fact that those things exist in order to protect people who are discriminated against in housing for generations. And you might think that that's over, but you might talk to people who live in that environment and decide whether it's actually over or not. The second thing that I think about as a student and teacher of history is I hear a lot of people talking about how individually they feel like they can't do anything. But I think about being a proud and active union member as a teacher. And I think about how that is the way that poor people and people who felt like they had no influence worked to gain influence in their society by working together, by organizing, by getting on the same page. And so I think about that, and I think about other protest movements that took strength in numbers and leveraged those numbers on the structures that they thought were oppressing them. So.
Kate Lasky and Darren Fowler, thanks very much for joining us. Community Library District, Darren Fowler is the mayor of Grants Pass. Pete Gendron joins us now, president of Oregon Sun Growers Guild. It's an industry group for outdoor marijuana growers. Good to have you here on the show.
Thank you very much.
I want to start with your experience that seems in its own way similar to what we were talking about with Kate Lasky. You helped the state set up both its legal recreational marijuana system and medical marijuana system as a member of commissions that were advising and saying this is the way these things should be set up. What was that process like to in a sense, create a new regulatory scheme, to create more government?
For better or for worse, welcome to an emerging industry. You get to deal with, in committee meetings, 15 people on a single committee, every which one of them has a different interest. You get to deal with the State House and the State Senate, you get to deal with the Governor's Office, the federal government, the concerns of the local medical consumers, the cultivators that have already been existing under a Measure 67 law for what is now 20 years, and the issues of new business developers moving in the area that aren't familiar with the community, aren't familiar with the territory, and quite frankly, don't know the laws, and honestly, in some cases, the state agencies themselves aren't 100% up to speed on the rules because they change every couple of months. It is not an easy endeavor.
So that sounds frustrating, complicated, and confusing, among other things. Was it interesting? Was it fun?
One of the primary reasons I was invited to the table and have stayed this course for the last 4 or 5 years now is the fact that for me it's not frustrating or confusing. I see the objectives that the state wants to accomplish. all the work that I've done, from being appointed by the governor to working with the Liquor Control Commission and other public agencies, has been geared, number one, towards public health and safety. That is the overarching goal for all of the other rules that we're creating. So whenever we're talking about taxation, regulation, transportation, consumption, distribution, methods of being able to give and receive these products, the number one concern on the table is always in the interest of public health and safety, and I would like to think that my participation in this process over the last 4 years has helped to provide that check and balance for the other agencies involved.
Has working on this, has it changed the way you think about government?
It has, because again, the primary focus of the work has been in the interest of public health and safety, and because I've had to work on one hand with bureaucrats that are in entrenched positions, the so-called deep state, if you will, and on the other hand, elected representatives at multiple levels, at the county and the state and federal levels, you have different dynamics working with each of those groups. And that's why I was so intrigued when I was asked to come here tonight and talk about the concept of what is government. There are several really good answers for what the nature of government is. A very simple and honest one is that government exists for the benefit of the governed. A more direct answer in modern government actually is derived from our own Constitution. When you look at government through the lens of the fact that government exists to ensure our God-given rights. Now that's very important to me because our rights aren't given to us by government. In fact, over the course of human history, up until just the last couple of centuries, government has primarily taken away people's rights. Our government was instituted to ensure people's rights. I give a presentation that I'm not going to do tonight, but it's a very entertaining 15 minutes on the history of lobbying. And it goes back to the year 1215, this document that we have called the Magna Carta. The slightly longer exposition on that goes to the first modern contract that still exists in the laws of man and in the rules of modern societies. It's actually the Hippocratic Oath, written about 4 centuries BC. It did not require a government entity to create the oath that Hippocrates developed, implemented, and then distributed first within the Greek and early Roman civilizations and then to the rest of the world. That first contract, that binding document, which is the first contract that we still recognize today, that was actually a rights of man contract, and that is what the government is designed to uphold ultimately.
Let's bring this back to now and marijuana, which is in such an interesting legal world because, as you know better than I do, but as everyone in the room knows, that there's a continuing federal prohibition, there is a state legality, and now there is a relatively complicated county fight about land use regulations and the state land use board of appeals, stuff we needn't get into. But the point here is that at the local, state, and federal levels, there are all these different ideas about what should happen. What does this tell you about how government is working in the U.S. right now?
To some extent, it tells me that government has done a very good job at dividing the population. And when you're looking at the nature of government today versus the nature of government as it was envisioned 200 or even 2,000 years ago, we don't even have the same groundwork to start out from. We're building on what we have in our current and recent histories, where the institutions like the Magna Carta were developed because we didn't have a right to petition the government for redress of grievances. We've developed on that. If we go back to the Genesis, we go back to pre-Christ, we go back to the Hippocratic Oath, and we look at why these contracts were originally formed, there were social compacts that are designed to develop our civilization, to develop our conditions that we live in for the benefit not just of ourselves, but for everybody around us. Literally, in one sense, you can consider billions of people and all of our individual mind power around this planet as a collective machine. It's one of the reasons that, quite simply, humanity doesn't fall under the same rules of expansion and contraction that the rest of the animal world does, because nothing else in the animal world works together the way billions of brains do for the benefit not just of themselves, but of their neighbors as well.
I was getting a little lost there, but I want to bring this again back to marijuana, and only because it's, to me, a good example of government working or perhaps not working, depending on your point of view. Could you argue that where we are with marijuana right now in this country and this county is a good example of the complicated patchwork we have of local, state, and federal control? It's all confusing right now, and we don't know where it's going to go, but this is what happens when you have a constitution which gives you a framework but doesn't fill everything in.
Okay, to me that question is almost a non sequitur, because now you're talking about battling branches of government, each battling for supremacy over each other, with no actual regard for the government.
Where is there not a regard for the government? Each individual branch, you could argue, is paying attention to the government, but then they start smacking into each other in painful ways.
I'm going to respectfully beg to differ. When you have the county suing the state and federal court, the federal government and the state court talking about suing their citizens directly, none of that actually has to do with the interests of the government. It only has to do with the interests of the government as an entity. One of the reasons that we put in things like term limits in the beginning was that we didn't want government to grow into an entity that was no longer in control of the governed. I work in a field that is compliance driven. I am the state's top compliance expert in the cannabis industry. I don't think you'll find anybody in this state that will argue that, from Steve Marks as the head of the OLCC on down the line. We created, through these bureaucracies, which are quasi-governmental agencies, they're not elected representatives. They are people who have been hired by elected representatives to do work that the elected representatives either could not or would not do. These quasi-governmental bodies, anything from the Land Use Board of Appeals through bureaucratic regulatory agencies like the OLCC, just as a couple of easy examples, there's a list of them as long as my arm. They don't actually represent the citizens directly. They do not represent a constituency. They represent their own bureaucratic interests. When's the last time you heard of a bureaucrat being fired for malfeasance or incompetence?
Yeah, I have a question for you, because I really want you to answer the question. I don't want a history of government. What I want to know is, what I see as a rub, why did Josephine County vote in favor of marijuana? And on the flip side, it seems like your industry faces, by elected officials, the inability to grow that industry when the voters of this county voted for it. I see that as a direct rub. What do you think?
We've had over, and pardon me, the sun's in my eyes this
That's
time of
all right.
evening, but we've had over 3,000, you look fine. We've had over 3,000 medical cultivators here cultivating on a small scale with few problems over a long period of time now. Some of the growth is caused by the fact that,
Why did we
again,
vote yes?
the government decided to come in and say, okay, we're going to change the rules. So what we actually voted for under Measure 91 is not what the state Senate delivered to us in the rulemaking process.
I so disagree. I'm going to say something. I certainly didn't vote yes or no based on some rules. I voted because I thought that it was more of a libertarian idea, that if you wanted to smoke weed, you had the right to do it. And that's where I think that most of the people in this county voted. Then when it came to establish rules, and that you can't impose your grow on my piece of land, because if your grow is next to my land, now you are imposing on me. So on one hand, it seemed like we voted for the right for you to do what you wanted, but when the rules had to be put in place, that's where the rub came. And that's kind of what I'm asking you is, or, because I didn't vote because of the rule, I voted because of the libertarian idea, or voted in favor of it.
Yeah, and that I agree, and that principle is one that holds. The way it's being implemented right now, I am also going to agree, is not what people expected. That's not what was planned, and this is what happens When government grows too big and gets too involved on one hand, and then on the other hand, isn't responsive to the people that it is supposed to exist, remember, for one primary reason, for the benefit of. There wouldn't be a conversation about this to begin with, remember, if the government hadn't decided to take away a God-given right. And now that the people have demanded it back, there's a problem with implementation, not because of the plant itself, but because of the fact that the government is still interfering with what is a God-given right that would be perfectly normal and natural and would have been practiced and balanced over the last century in this state had it not been for government manipulation and interference to begin with.
Lois and Dylan, I want to give you a chance to end us today, end the show, don't end us. I'm wondering if what you've just been talking about here, what we've just been talking about here, could be seen as, is a feature of the Constitution or a bug? I mean, is this kind of messy, confusing interactions between different levels of government, is this the point of the U.S. Constitution, or is it a problem?
Well, I think that I distinguish between the two founding documents that we have, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Declaration of Independence, and what he's talking about is his right, is an inalienable right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
God's given ability to grow marijuana.
I have it. Yes, that's, I would say that there's other rights, but I wouldn't put that on the top of my list, but yeah, that is one.
Our right is to come up with our own list, though, I suppose.
But the nuts and bolts are going to come in what a government does to protect it, to protect the right. And that nuts and bolts are messy. And that's kind of where I'm going. The Constitution that was created on the federal level, I loved your question on the state level, because the state constitutions from the beginning were more important than the federal Constitution for people's rights. And that some of the states had Bill of Rights and some didn't.
Why do you think people don't carry state constitutions around?
They should. I
No, but why do you think they
don't? Because they don't know, well, they're really, they don't know that there's a state. I don't even think they know there's a state constitution, and that it is more personal to you than the federal Constitution. But as the federal Constitution had great flaws, we talk about this perfect Constitution. It wasn't perfect at all. It had the 3/5 clause of enslaved people being counted. And the state Constitution, I think we have to look at that and simplify that. If we understood, I don't know the state Constitution. When you asked it, I kind of am ashamed of myself because I really don't know it. So I think if we knew our state and local constitutions, I think we would probably govern better. And here's another rub, and just to end it, Kate's right, there's not enough people running for office. And you know why? Because it's so hard. It is hard when you have to get into the nuts and bolts and face your community, and you have this friend that disagrees with you. It is really hard work. I don't think, first time I got elected in Idaho at age 35, and I was not prepared for that kind of pressure. And I knew that going into the room, you had to compromise. You had a lot of different people at the table. So I just really think that if we understood our constitutions and then we had the mind to go in and compromise on our positions, that we would have better solutions.
Lois McMillan and Pete Gendron, thanks very much. Thank you. For outdoor marijuana growers, and Lois McMillan is a history teacher, among other things, at the South Middle School in Grants Pass. Special thanks today to John Connor and all the folks here at the Hall. If you don't want to miss any of our shows, you can subscribe on the NPR One app, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Our nightly rebroadcast is at 8 p.m. Thanks very much for tuning in today. I'm Dave Miller. We will join you tomorrow.